Somewhere in Level Cross, there is a garage that has never been opened to the public. Not once. Not for money, not for documentaries, and not even for the most determined collectors who have traveled across the country hoping for a glimpse inside. Every serious offer has been rejected by Richard Petty. Behind those closed doors sit somewhere between 15 and 20 race cars stacked on top of one another, untouched for decades, along with pieces of NASCAR history that no museum has ever been allowed to display. The real mystery is not how much those objects are worth. The real mystery is why the most celebrated driver in NASCAR history has chosen to keep them hidden, and what that decision reveals about the man behind the legend. To understand why that garage matters, you first have to understand the scale of Richard Petty's career. Without that context, the cars are simply aging machines covered in dust. With it, they become some of the most important surviving artifacts in American motorsports. The number that defines everything is 200. That is how many NASCAR Cup Series races Richard Petty won between 1958 and 1992. The next closest driver in history, David Pearson, finished with 105 victories. Petty did not merely break the record, he nearly doubled it. Add to that 7 Cup Series championships, 7 Daytona 500 victories, 123 pole positions, 513 consecutive starts from 1971 through 1989, and 1,184 career starts across 35 years, and the picture becomes almost impossible to comprehend. These are not records that have slowly been approached over time. They are records that have become permanent landmarks in the sport, achievements so far beyond everyone else that NASCAR treats them less like targets and more like mountains that simply exist on the horizon. The dominance was never just Richard's alone. Petty Enterprises, founded by his father Lee Petty in 1949 in the tiny community of Level Cross, became the most successful family operation in NASCAR history. Lee won 3 championships before Richard inherited the famous number 43. Richard's brother, Maurice Petty, built the engines that powered most of those 200 victories, while their cousin Dale Inman served as crew chief through the majority of Richard's championship years. For members of the same family, from the same small North Carolina town, all eventually entered the NASCAR Hall of Fame. The Level Cross compound where those cars were built, tuned, repaired, and sent out to dominate stock car racing for decades still stands today. And at the center of that compound is the private garage that outsiders have not truly been allowed to enter for years. Richard Petty has admitted that during the 1960s and 1970s, he never imagined old race cars would someday become priceless collectibles. A used stock car was simply a used stock car. Teams needed money for the next build, so older cars were sold to smaller teams, stripped for parts, or left behind altogether. Petty has openly said that he sold several of his former race cars to West Coast racers for whatever price he could get because nobody at the time believed a battered NASCAR machine might one day be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Preservation was not part of the culture then. Winning the next race was. The cars that were not sold eventually ended up stacked behind the garage in Level Cross. Petty has estimated that 15 to 20 remain there, piled together in a field beside the building, exposed to North Carolina weather for decades. They were never restored, catalogued, or displayed behind velvet ropes. They were simply left where the racing years had ended. Those cars represent both an extraordinary piece of NASCAR history and a painful reminder of how much early stock car heritage disappeared before anyone realized it needed saving. Petty has spoken about that loss with unusual honesty, acknowledging that many important cars were simply allowed to slip away because no one understood what they would someday mean. The cars that survived inside the garage were kept for completely different reasons. They were not preserved because they might become valuable. They were preserved because of what happened inside them, who built them, who drove them, and what moments of life became attached to them. A car saved for auction is an investment. A car saved because it carried someone through a championship, a crash, a family memory, or a defining afternoon at a racetrack is something entirely different. The garage in Level Cross is filled with the second kind. 2 vehicles inside that building sit at opposite ends of Richard Petty's career, and together they tell his entire story more clearly than any trophy room ever could. The first is the legendary Plymouth Superbird. Built for the 1970 season to exploit NASCAR's aerodynamic rules, the Superbird was created for one purpose: speed. Its pointed nose cone and towering rear wing were not styling gimmicks. They were engineering solutions designed by Chrysler's racing division to reduce drag and increase downforce at nearly 200 miles per hour. During that season, Petty won 18 races in Plymouth machinery, and the Superbird became forever linked with the blue number 43. The example sitting in the level cross garage has never been restored into a polished show car. Tire debris still clings beneath it, and the body retains the scars of real racing contact from decades ago. It remains exactly what it was when it left competition, a working race car, not a museum display. A Superbird with authentic Petty history is considered one of the most significant surviving pieces of American motorsports, yet this one has never been placed on the open market. The second car is far less glamorous but perhaps even more important. It is a 1957 Oldsmobile built by hand in the family garage by Lee Petty and his sons, and it is the very car in which Richard Petty made his NASCAR debut. By modern standards, it is crude, weathered, and heavily rusted, but that rust exists because the car was kept for what it represented, not for what it could sell for. The Superbird represents the peak of Richard Petty's greatness. The Oldsmobile represents the moment before any of the greatness existed, when a 20-year-old from a small North Carolina town pointed a homemade race car toward a racetrack and discovered the path that would eventually change NASCAR forever. Beyond the race cars, toolboxes, and decades of equipment stored throughout the main garage lies a smaller room that very few people have ever entered. Former employees of Petty Enterprises have occasionally mentioned it over the years, but it has never appeared on public tours or in official museum exhibits. Those who know about it often describe it the same way: a quiet place where Richard Petty set aside the items that meant too much to put on display. While the museum celebrates the public history of his career, this room preserves the deeply personal side of it. Inside are far more than trophies and racing memorabilia. There are boxes filled with fan letters from the 1960s and 1970s, many of them still unopened. Richard Petty never kept them because he planned to answer every message. He kept them because throwing them away never felt right. They came from children who looked up to him, veterans who found inspiration in his determination, and ordinary fans who saw something in his racing that connected with their own lives. Each envelope carried a personal story, written by someone who believed a driver from a small North Carolina town would somehow understand what they were feeling. Instead of discarding those letters, Petty quietly saved them, allowing them to become part of his own history. The room also contains items connected to the late Dale Earnhardt Sr., whose death during the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500 changed NASCAR forever. Although Petty and Earnhardt spent years competing against one another, they shared a level of mutual respect that extended well beyond the racetrack. They represented different generations, different personalities, and different approaches to racing, yet both understood the sacrifices required to reach the top of the sport. The objects Richard Petty kept from that friendship are not displayed as collectibles or souvenirs. According to those who have seen them, they remain where they are because they represent a relationship that words could never fully explain. They are reminders of someone who understood the unique pressures of greatness better than almost anyone else. Among the most haunting objects in the room is the remains of Richard Petty's most famous crash. During the 1980 race at Pocono Raceway, his car became airborne, rolled violently several times, and slammed back to the ground in one of the most terrifying accidents of his career. Many believed the crash would end his racing days. Remarkably, Petty climbed away from the wreckage. Instead of repairing or discarding the damaged frame, he chose to keep it exactly as it was when the rescue crews finished their work. The twisted metal has never been restored, repainted, or straightened. It remains frozen in time, preserving the physical evidence of a day that could easily have ended in tragedy. Richard Petty has never publicly explained why he decided to keep the wrecked frame. Perhaps he never felt the need to. Those who have stood in front of it often say the answer becomes obvious without a single word being spoken. Looking at the crushed steel is a powerful reminder that every victory came with enormous risk. It represents the fragile line between triumph and disaster that every driver accepts the moment the green flag waves. For Richard Petty, it appears to serve not as a trophy, but as a permanent reminder that surviving was never guaranteed. As remarkable as the contents of that hidden room may be, they are only part of the larger story. Over the years, collectors, museums, and wealthy enthusiasts have repeatedly tried to purchase pieces of what remains inside the level cross garage. Some wanted individual race cars. Others hoped to acquire handwritten racing notes, championship memorabilia, or artifacts connected to NASCAR's greatest dynasty. The offers were often substantial, reaching amounts that would have changed the value of almost any private collection. Richard Petty refused them all. The financial value of everything inside the garage is difficult to calculate because almost none of it has ever been offered for sale. Experts who have examined portions of the collection believe the combined worth of the race cars, handwritten setup notes, championship memorabilia, race-worn equipment, and personal keepsakes could easily reach $10 million or more, depending on market conditions. Even so, Petty has never treated the collection as an investment. To him, its value has never been measured in dollars. Private collectors have approached him. Major institutions have expressed interest in displaying parts of the collection in rotating exhibitions. Serious offers have arrived from people who understood exactly what these artifacts represented. Every one of those conversations ended the same way. Richard Petty declined, not because he questioned the money being offered, but because selling them would mean giving up something that could never truly be replaced. The decision becomes even more remarkable when viewed alongside the difficult years of Petty enterprises. During the late 1990s and early 2000s, the legendary racing team struggled as NASCAR evolved into an increasingly expensive, corporate-driven sport. Rising costs forced the organization to seek outside investment, restructure its operations, and eventually transform into Petty's Garage in 2008, shifting its focus toward custom-built vehicles and restoration work. Those challenging years presented countless opportunities for Richard Petty to cash in on the priceless collection sitting behind closed doors. Auction houses knew what was hidden there. Wealthy collectors knew it too. Many believed financial pressure might eventually persuade him to sell. It never did. For Richard Petty, the garage was never a financial safety net. It was a place where memories lived, and memories were never something he intended to place on the auction block. The public can still experience part of the Petty legacy by visiting the Petty Museum, originally established by Richard's late wife, Linda, in 1988. After spending several years in nearby Randleman, the museum returned to the Level Cross property in 2014, where visitors can explore championship-winning race cars, trophies, uniforms, photographs, and decades of carefully preserved NASCAR history. The museum tells the public story of Richard Petty's extraordinary career. The garage tells the private one. Everything displayed inside the museum represents what Richard Petty chose to share with the world. Everything locked away inside the garage represents what he chose to keep for himself. And that difference is where the real story begins.